we see these kind of pieces of clothing that were developed for sports trickle their way into fashion. And we see this with sneakers. That's really something that happens in the later half of the 20th century. And it's definitely evolved revolving around youth cultures, hip hop being one of them.
Yo, this is Reg Ferguson, Fashion Geek #1. How are you? Welcome to the ride. Thank you so much for listening. I am a men's fashion consultant here in New York City, and I help the everyday man achieve his goals and live his best life by taking him from fashion confused to fashion confident. If you ever found yourself staring at the closet, not knowing what to wear, or if the idea of shopping for clothes makes you feel physically ill, then this is the show for you. My goal with every episode is to help make looking good feel easy. If you ever want my help, email me at reg@nyfashiongeek.com for a consultation. If you have a friend who's looking to level up his fashion style wardrobe game, please share an episode with them. While you're at it, if you dig the show and haven't already left us a rating and review, please consider doing so now. Your shares, ratings, and reviews help us grow the show and help us get the best possible guests and help more men dress their best. Today, we are going to talk with Elizabeth Way of F.I.T, Fashion Institute of Technology, who is in New York, and we're going to talk about something the everyday man should have an interest in. Is hip-hop style still relevant in the 21st century? And what influence does it have on streetwear? Elizabeth in the building, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
No, I really appreciate it. You know, this is a big coup for me. So, so before we go into our topic, please tell us, so what do you do?
So my name is Elizabeth Way, and I'm an associate curator at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. I'm a fashion historian, and I've been curating for about 10 years. I'm also the co-curator of our current exhibition, Fresh, Fly, and Fabulous, 50 Years of Hip Hop Style.
Well, you see, I'm just cheesing because that's what brought us together. And as everyone knows in my listening audience, I am now doing video. So I had to represent here. And as Elizabeth knows, this sweatshirt is also in the exhibition at the museum at FIT. No, I did not G it. This is mine. Had this since back in the day, put my nickels together. I remember exactly where I bought it. The place where I bought it up in the Bronx where the people are fresh is now it's a Walgreens. Which broke my heart. This place was one of the places. I can't remember the name. It was 2 initials. It was on Westchester Avenue in the Hunts Point section, right there underneath the L tracks at Simpson Street, where I bought a lot of my gear, which reflects the topic that we're discussing today. So just for everyone, for sure, clarity and transparency. I have 2 friends who are professors at FIT. They told me about the 50th anniversary symposium that was occurring there. I had no clue, and I wrangled my way in. Miss Way was very nice and invited me. And then, because I'm a New Yorker, I parlayed that, son, and got her on the pod. So thank you again. And again, I'm just cheesing because really what I really am excited about pertaining to this conversation is that we have the ability of someone like you to actually have a scholarship on this topic for something that for me was just part of my growing up. I went to live with my grandparents. I'm from Manhattan. I'm from the West Village. Went to live with my grandparents up in the Soundview section. And if anything knows about Soundview, much less the Bronx, there's a lot going on in terms of the development of the culture of hip hop, particularly through rap music, but also through fashion. So why is this still so relevant, Elizabeth?
Well, hip hop fashion is infinitely relevant to the way we dress today because it amplified and fostered a few key movements that have shaped 21st century dress. Streetwear is probably kind of the biggest and the most kind of amorphous of these movements, but we can go down, to specific objects like sneaker culture. Sneakers are everywhere today, from runways, to kind of the average office worker being able to level up to a sneaker that kind of fits in with their everyday wardrobe instead of having to change out of it on their walking commute. This idea of kind of more casual, more comfortable clothing, but also that clothing is elevated to a fashion space. It's not, athletic wear in a separate category. It's fashion. And so hip hop had a lot to do with kind of making that the norm of dressing in 21st century American culture. And through that, changing international fashion culture.
Well, you're right. I think the fashion reflects the overall art form of rap because, rap started here in the city. I'm a native New Yorker, so it's one of the things I just passionately claim. And obviously, it was blacks and browns that really, created this art form and created and developed the culture. And sometimes still, as I reflect my time and my age, it totally throws me off that people who do not look like me really can more than hold their own, quoting rap lyrics, knowing artists, and articulating about the culture really in a pure level. It's unquestionable, but yet it throws me off. But you hit on something, and also I have to do a big shout out, and I'm hoping this way will bless me with her the reading of my blog. I literally just relaunched my website, so it's a new website for the business, nyfashiongeek.com. The new site dropped on Tuesday. A blog post also dropped on Tuesday. And the whole premise behind my blog, which originally I was trying to make it a long form piece for GQ and get a polite personal rejection, which I've been told in the game is pretty cool. The point is, you mentioned streetwear. And the premise of my blog post is that streetwear didn't just all of a sudden pop out of nowhere. It literally came from hip hop culture. You mentioned sneaker culture. So, care to offer an opinion on that? Because I just hate that people are like streetwear. I'm like, no, it came from us.
Well, I mean, streetwear can be streetwear is such a big category and it can be defined in so many different ways. And so the
Sure.
way I kind of think about streetwear is an evolution from sportswear as a mindset of dressing to streetwear. And this is a move towards more casual dressing. But again, elevating very casual, athletic inspired pieces to fashion. And we do have a lot of forces kind of going on in American culture. Hip hop is probably the biggest and one of the most kind of important in pushing this streetwear culture into kind of the way that we all dress today. We have other subcultural influences, for example, skater culture, punk, a lot of youth culture for sure. We also have kind of bigger movements in the 70s and 80s. We have a big emphasis, especially for women, on exercise and dance, movies like Flashdance, things like these were all affecting fashion. But hip hop took those references as well and made it their own. But I would definitely say that hip hop, because of the popularity of the music, you talk about, people who look different from you being able to kind of, quote rap lyrics in a very authentic way. Hip hop is American culture. By
Absolutely.
the 1990s, it had just completely permeated youth culture, American culture. Gen X is now kind of, they're adults. Elder millennials are now adults, and they grew up on hip hop. And so it was just such a big part of the culture that the fashion naturally followed that kind of cultural kind of saturation. So for sure, hip hop was one of the biggest, if not the biggest force to take streetwear and make it mainstream fashion.
Yeah. And you hit on something because now rap music is the popular music. When I was growing up, it was rebel music along with punk rock.
Hmm.
And, there's some great parallels there and occasional intermixing at places like Danceteria when I was a little kid, as I date myself, having a friend of mine, sneak/drag me in there and just going, wow. And also that was just cool because I was back in Manhattan because because I missed Manhattan, going to the Bronx from there. So you mentioned sneaker culture. So clearly one could argue sneaker culture is endemic to America. But I think that when we categorize sneaker culture, it really emanates from the 80s on. But certainly I would say sneaker culture predates the 80s.
For sure. We see athletic shoes kind of with rubber soles going back to the late 19th century, early
Right.
20th century, used specifically for sports. And over the course of the 20th century, we see these kind of pieces of clothing that were developed for sports trickle their way into fashion. And we see this with sneakers. That's really something that happens in the later half of the 20th century. And it's definitely evolved revolving around youth cultures, hip hop being one of them. But, because Black and Brown communities, at this time, there were very few kind of cultural resources that they could look to, that they could identify with, that embrace them. So they created their own, and hip hop was one of them. But another really important kind of cultural force was sports, because we do see a lot of Black and Brown athletes succeeding and being recognized. And so you have people like Michael Jordan. And so when they're releasing a sneaker, it's resonating with Black and Brown kids. And of course, a lot of these kids kind of overlap in the Venn diagram of hip hop. And so that's one major reason why kind of sneaker culture is so important in hip hop. But hip hop definitely kind of took it to the next level in terms of connoisseurship, in terms of collecting, in terms of the way they wore sneakers. We have examples in the exhibition of fat lace sneakers worn by b-boys in the 1970s and 1980s. So customizing those things, even just the idea of keeping your sneakers flawless, this idea that Black and Brown people have had for generations about the way they need to present themselves in mainstream society in order to be taken seriously, in order to avoid violence. And of course, these things don't protect us, but it is still a mindset of dressing, showing up in your as your best. And even when kids moved towards much more casual clothing, they took those ideas with them.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about sneakers being pristine. Again, as I continue to date myself, I remember having a pair of Nike Cortez, and I had what every kid had in New York City, much less the Bronx. I had a corresponding toothbrush and and, and white kiwi lotion, liquid lotion.
Hmm.
Because if there was one mark on my sneaker, my life was over. It would be a heartbreaking sight. So I remember my late grandparents just looking at me, just remarking like, what is he doing? What is he doing?" But it was all about keeping it fresh.
Hmm.
So, like you said, again, these are through lines through time that African American culture are about Sunday best. I mean, this is a direct pipeline of that. That
Absolutely.
that that the crease should be permanent and should be sharp. Everything is about being as sharp as you can with whatever you have. And we had a previous conversation in which you were really talking about the whole melange of different items from different cultures and how really hip hop remixed it in terms of, for example, a polo shirt here and, a shearling, which we called back then a sheepdog back then. So,
Well, in the exhibition, we look at some designers from other spaces, but we really do focus on New York City. And it's really about the experience of dressing. You talk about cleaning your sneakers and the rituals around dressing and keeping yourself fresh and fly. My co-creator Elena Romero also grew up in New York. She's from
right.
Brooklyn. She talked about going down to Delancey Street and haggling for your sheepskin was a rite of passage.
Yes.
And so it's not just wearing the clothes and putting the clothes together in unique ways, which hip hop kids absolutely did. It was the whole ritual of dressing, acquiring the clothing. It's really comparable to like 19th century dandies. You think about Beau Brummel tying his cravat. These kids were just as intense about the details. Really an amazing clothing culture that has been, disseminated. A lot of people today don't have the time or the inclination or the understanding to kind of dress in that kind of detailed way. But we certainly take the tropes that these kids developed and work it into our wardrobes.
Absolutely. I often have said on this podcast that really my current fashion sensibility obviously starts from childhood, but in two separate schools. Classic menswear, due to my late grandfather and watching him, observing him, and also him literally teaching me, nurturing me in the ways of being a man and being a gentleman through your fashion, through your style. teach me how to tie a tie in the same tie knot I use today. But moving from Manhattan to the Bronx, which you could see on my face, was a big thing.
Hmm.
Like, help! Like, love to live with my grandparents, love my grandparents, but what? Because back then, New York City was extremely balkanized. And literally, people knew if you were intruding, so to speak, into their neighborhood, much less their borough,
Hmm.
because there were certain tells, even through fashion, much less just how you spoke, that would let people know, hey, what are you doing here? And we may have to chase you out. The other school was hip hop, and that
Hmm.
still influences me to this day. You mentioned detail. I think that's the reason why I got led into the space of men's fashion consultancy, because of my eye for detail, which clearly started as a child, but got honed and nurtured over time through my family, and then on my own accord in an erudite manner. So I think till I die, those two schools will always be prevalent. It doesn't mean like often you'll see in an old school rap concert in which the crew is still rocking the same gear as if they're frozen in time. Meaning, I had to pull this out. I want to be really clear, y'all. First of all, my favorite rap group of all time, but I pulled this out of my storage loft. This is not in regular rotation. I actually had to knock off the dust.
Well, one of
So
the things I want to point out about what you said, which I really love, is that classic menswear certainly has a huge influence and a place within hip hop style. I think people's understanding of hip hop style is kind of frozen in a certain moment, right? And it stays relevant because we see constantly references back to the 80s and 90s when it comes to hip hop style. Also, we're in a current moment where the younger generation is very interested in fashion from the 1990s and the 2000s. But in the exhibition, we look at pieces, from Sean John, or even the ensemble that Dapper Dan wore to win his CFDA award. And both of these figures are from Harlem. And they have a very specific fashion reference that's all about vintage 1920s, 1930s kind of menswear style that is particularly tied to Harlem. And of course, we have these formal wear kind of veins all throughout New York and the rest of the country. But formal wear is a really important part of hip hop style.
well, you hit on something. We had a conversation previously, and I'd like to bring that back. We mentioned Frozen in Time, or I mentioned Frozen in Time, and you echoed it. And I certainly don't want to speak out of both sides of my mouth, but we know that time is fluid. So, in a previous conversation, you mentioned how, from a current standpoint, how hip hop has gone Lux. And obviously, Sean John, the Sean John brand, and DAP clearly reflected that, but they reflected that in an earlier time. So if we look now in the 21st century, back to the initial question, you know, discord on Lux in hip hop, and you know, why is this even existing?
Well, I mean, as hip hop celebrities became wealthier, they became more well known. They took some of the same like veins of style, the same topics that they were thinking about when they were starting out, like customization, like individualization, and they just put through more money at it. So in the exhibition, we have examples of nameplate belts from the 80s and 90s in brass, silver plated. And then we can compare that to these beautiful renderings of these diamond name chains from things that were worn by Cardi B or Drake. And what we see is the same idea. We see a nameplate, and it's all about kind of declaring your visibility. There was so many forces in mainstream society trying to make Black and brown kids invisible in the 70s and 80s. Those still exist today. But so they're taking these old school hip hop ideas and they just take it to the highest level, covered in diamonds, dripping. And we see that with the fashion, right? Tracksuits were in fashion. They were Adidas or Fila in the 1980s. Now they're made by Gucci and Louis Vuitton. And so we see these same ideas that these luxury companies have taken from hip hop, and they're being worn by the hip hop artists. So there's really much more of a kind of reciprocal dialogue now, but it really is happening on this luxury level.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the reciprocity, because certainly back in the 70s and 80s, not necessarily kids, because kids are kids, but Black and brown adults were being ignored by these European brands.
For sure. We interviewed Dapper Dan for the exhibition, which we were so excited about, and he talked about
I've
he
always
talked
wanted him. Oh, you're so lucky.
he talked about being in his atelier, and he always says that he's not about the clothes are a reflection of kind of how he views an individual. And he's always trying to bring out aspects of their personality through his design work. And so he talks about sitting in his atelier, and when someone comes into his store, he gets up and he greets them at the door. He says hello. He has a conversation with them. And this was a marked difference from the way they were treated on Fifth Avenue going into these luxury department stores. He wanted that to be a difference, that he wanted them to feel respected, to feel seen, and to feel welcome in his store because they were feeling the exact opposite way in the luxury brands downtown.
Sure. Yeah, we would affectionately call that N watch back in the day. That you had the means, but you're literally being scoped from the moment you walk in to the moment you left. And to your point, why patronize these brands? When I think of Run DMC, and there's really an irony here based on the lyric because they're talking about Calvin Klein saying, "I don't want anybody's name on my behind," but then they ink a deal with Adidas.
First, the first hip hop group to have a fashion endorsement, and this was the first time a company like Adidas, a sporting wear company, had an endorsement with a non-athlete. This was a big moment, and it was a $1 million deal in 1986, and that's a lot of money back then. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a lot of money now, I guess, but like
Yeah,
it was a
yeah.
lot.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, no, no. I literally remember when the deal got inked. This is that sweatshirt, from that collection. I mean, it. I never wore shell heads. I was more of a Nike kid,
Mhm.
but again, my favorite group, love the song My Adidas. They get the deal, and this is why I copped this. I went. I have to be a part of this.
Yeah. And we see
Like
that
any
same
kid.
energy. Absolutely. We see that same energy when Dapper Dan did his collaboration with the Gap recently, and they had the Dap sweatshirt, so sold out immediately.
Yeah.
There's still this kind of hunger for these more accessible pieces. Of course, going to Dapper Dan's atelier is certainly out of my range, out of the range of
Me
many
too.
people, or the Gucci collaboration. So when he does a collaboration with Gap, people are excited to get a piece of that style for themselves.
Yeah, certainly, because really DAP, from a New York standpoint, is mythologized,
Hmm.
and he certainly is a legend. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but the link I gave you to the podcast to try to get into the symposium wanted to prove that I was down. I mentioned Dapper Dan. I have an episode dedicated to him. He's kind of my white whale. I've always wanted him on the pod. It hasn't happened. I've come close. But again, being a native New Yorker, being of that time, you know, I know a lot about him and I know a lot about that store. And I didn't grow up in Harlem, but you can't be black and not know about Harlem in New York. And I remember walking past that store. And then, as in now, still inaccessible for my black ass. So,
But aspiration has also been kind of this constant theme within hip hop fashion. And
yes.
it's such a force for moving fashion forward in the different ways that it occurs. We can talk about the low lives and the way they acquired the fashion that they wanted. And that
Literally.
fashion represented an American dream. Hearing people like Thurston Howell talk today, they can really break down kind of their thought process when they were younger and thinking about Ralph Lauren as this Jewish kid from the Bronx who, you know, he wasn't a person who was welcomed into these waspy American, these American circles, but he created it himself and turned it into $1 billion company. And that was something that they respected.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, one of the greatest American storytellers. So, because
Absolutely.
like you said, Jewish kid from the Bronx off of Marshallou Parkway, and he's the go-to for the story of the Western Way, and he's the story of you know the life of the Hamptons. I mean, he has that gift, and I mean that also is just an amazing New York City story because an immigrant story. His parents were from Europe. He comes here and he makes and paves a way and creates a way of life again about Aspiration, like his face should be there in Merriam-Webster, because he has made and continues to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you hit on something, the whole lack of accessibility for this type of clothing, particularly when you talk about low lives, right? So I wouldn't even necessarily claim to be low life adjacent, but I remember that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Thurston Howell keeps it real, and I love him to death, from afar. But these goods were gotten in nefarious ways. So,
But you can also look at it from a historical perspective and think about the impact they made in popularizing Ralph Lauren within hip hop
absolutely,
and keeping that relevancy for so, so long. I mean, Ralph Lauren has done a lot of different lines and a lot of different things. And, he has a high fashion line and, makes gowns. But when we think about kind of the American sportswear that he was creating, the type he was creating in the 80s and 90s and the longevity of those lines, I think you have to trace it back to the lowlives. And that's something that they as a brand have recognized. They've done projects with Thurston Howell,
yeah.
advertisements, like they recognize that as well. And that's a long evolution from kind of the way that relationship started out in the 1980s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's in Ralph's book, I've been told, because I didn't claim to read the book, but I've seen a quote. So no, he knows, and and Tommy Hilfiger, which is really the progeny of someone like Ralph. I mean, the same acknowledgement, and
Mhm.
we were both fortunate enough to hear Andy, make that extremely clear. And then also at the museum, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lovely video with both brothers, and they tell the story. And I'm here to say that that was really refreshing to hear, because we know that as people of color, particularly here in New York City, we're the tastemakers. So
Absolutely.
we take these brands like Dapper Dan. Like, I'll tell you to this day that and I literally have a podcast episode of that podcast episode. I'm like,
Mhm.
Uh, no, he took the actual fabric and then made the jacket. He didn't know. He didn't No, he took the actual bags and he made it the fabric. Like, that was because literally, he was creating these items, but obviously he had a printing press and the silk and all that and the machines. I'm like, no, he took it from each individual bag and then he made a coat. That's what he did. But that was just always so fascinating to me, but we have always been fascinating in this culture. And the
Right.
interesting thing, again, through time, is things enter from the subculture and then become mainstream culture. And that's why when you were talking about the transition that I kind of nudged you on about, oh my gosh, okay, the rebel music is the popular music. The brands that ignored us now embrace us. And again, this is what time does.
Mhm.
So,
Well, what's interesting about, you can look at something like rock and roll that, of course, Black people, had a huge hand in creating,
well,
but
we
was like
created it. Yeah.
absolutely largely, but it was largely coded white. And so you have a lot of white artists. And so it moves from this rebel music to something that's much more mainstream. Now it's like kind of oldies or whatever. It's not quite as relevant.
Right.
But because Black people and hip hop today, we have so many Latinx creators, but hip hop today is so connected to Black communities. Black communities never attained mainstream. It's to this day we don't have mainstream status. To this day, we're still facing all of this marginalization. And so hip hop was able to straddle the line and becoming kind of mainstream, but also keeping this kind of this edge, this outsider status. And we're taking this legacy of kind of fashion created in Black communities, from the 19th century, from earlier, and you take all of these forces, and it makes hip hop just incredibly powerful as a force within fashion.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question, and certainly, like any music form, for you know for white America to embrace this equally as passionately, it might have started as voyeurism, but certainly transformed that, I think, for a lot of individuals. I mean, again, talking about the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and this being the birthplace as a city. I have a friend of mine, and he's a white Jewish guy from Bayside, Queens, and rap is just as important to him as it is to me. And we went to the Frodo Fiska exhibit. Uh, him and his wife beat me to a museum at FIT, but I quickly gained ground. So, and we can talk about that because we're both New Yorkers, and though we did not know each other as kids, we're both New Yorkers, and
Hmm.
we're both of that age, as you said. So, we're part of the golden era. So, to have that type of conversation and just again just show the immense popularity and how it grows and spreads. It starts from a very indigenous manner, but really indigenous is also just New York City.
Yeah.
So, it grows in this way. And like I said, we can talk about that. You've said it, but I just want you to say it again, probably just in a different way. Why is hip hop fashion relevant in the 21st century?
Well, because hip hop fashion is now kind of completely conflated with streetwear.
Right.
And streetwear is how we dress. That's just the way we dress in the 21st century. But just, I mean, again, this idea of taking, we're all moving towards more kind of comfort and casual kind of clothing. That was a movement that started, I mean, in the 19th century, and we've kind of seen it come to fruition in the late 20th and early 20th century. But hip hop made that fashionable. Hip hop made that stylish. And so it wasn't just a move towards comfort and, unrestriction on your body. People still want to express their personalities, their creativity, their style. And hip hop transformed casual clothing into a way that we could do that. So it's just I can't emphasize enough like how much it's affected the way all of us dress, whether we kind of understand its origin in hip hop or consider ourselves to be a part of hip hop culture. Hip hop's influence on dress has impacted the way everyone dresses.
Why is Dapper Dan your most influential designer of the late 20th century?
Dapper Dan opened a dialogue between European luxury through logos, but also through kind of craftsmanship and quality and a couture kind of way of making clothes, and American sportswear, which is one of the kind of factors that kind of led to the creation of streetwear. And so taking these luxury logos and putting them on bomber jackets, but not just a bomber jacket, he's going to make it double breasted. He's going to make it out of
Right.
leather, two colors of leather. He's opening up this dialogue. And if we look at runways today, ready to wear runways, especially menswear, but women's wear as well, we see those ideas. We see this idea of taking pieces of sportswear and merging it with European luxury and creating streetwear from it. It's just absolutely everywhere.
No, I hear you. And I mean, I have to smile because I really feel there should be a disclaimer in this conversation that we are preaching to the converted. But I have to ask the tough questions because I think the questions are legitimate, they're valid. What is your favorite piece in your exhibit at the museum at FIT?
Okay, well, I have many favorites, but I'm going to talk about a menswear piece
All
because of
right.
where I am. We have a tuxedo that was lent to us by Ralph Lauren. It was custom made for Chance the Rapper for the Met Gala, I
Okay.
believe in 2022. Um, and it makes a lot of visual reference to the Stadium collection in 1992. So we have an original Stadium jacket also on loan to us from Ralph Lauren from 92, this sportswear piece that has become kind of what it's been dubbed kind of given suicide status within hip hop culture, meaning that it is so coveted. The idea of wearing it on the street is like, it's like suicide. You're going to get boosted. And so Chance the Rapper talks about having this tuxedo made for him. And he really described it as his Cinderella moment. He grew up loving polo, loving the Stadium collection, perhaps not being able to access it in the way that he wanted to. So to step out at the Met Ball on the red carpet in a custom made tuxedo that was a throwback to the Stadium that he loved in 1992, that was an important moment for him. And red carpet fashion for men, I find to be kind of boring. You see an impeccable tuxedo, you see an impeccable suit, and it's beautiful, but there's that's where kind of the conversation ends, right? Most of the time, I'll say. But
Take
that
that, take that. Ooh, that was a shot.
but that tuxedo is such an important moment that brings together so many themes within the exhibition and really speaks to this place in hip hop fashion, in American fashion, and how important it was for people of color, for young kids, and like you say, not just kids of color, but how important it was in how they shaped their own culture and how that culture's had an effect on American culture. It's this generation, Generation X, taking over from the generation before. And so I think that that is a really important and beloved piece within the exhibition.
How difficult was it to curate pieces? You are the co-curator.
Yes.
I don't know how many pieces are there, but you're there for over an hour. How difficult, process, methodology? How does this work?
So I'll tell you a little bit about how we put the exhibition together. We have
Please.
over 150 objects, and these came from over 50 different lenders, not including our permanent collection here at MFIT, which we have pieces from that as well.
Hmm.
So I co-curated this exhibition with Elena Romero, and
Yes.
she is a professor at FIT in marketing communications, but she's also a working journalist, and she's been working for the fashion trades like WWD, DNR, which is now defunct, since the 1990s. And so she really covered the emergence of what was then called urban brands. And that's, a word that, a loaded word.
Yep.
She really covered and, advocated for covering the importance of these brands. Brands like Fubu and Fat Farm were doing multi-million dollars of business, tens of millions of dollars of business every year. And the fashion industry wasn't really taking it seriously. It was kind of shunted off into this other category, young men's category, which wasn't, considered as exciting or relevant as women's wear. So she was really on the ground as this was happening. And she wrote a book in 2012. And so she pitched the idea of doing an exhibition to celebrate the 50-year anniversary to the museum at FIT. So she's a guest curator with us. And this was way back in 2018. We started working on it. I was brought on board as her co-curator. And we started working on it in 2019. So 4 years of work, of going to people's archives, contacting people. We drew a lot on Elena's network to get into the archives of people like Sal Abatello, who owned Disco Fever, of Ralph McDaniels, of designers like April Walker and 5001 Flavors. The museum has contacts with places like Gucci and Louis Vuitton, who we borrowed things from, Moschino, Terry Mugler. So it was really a combined effort of kind of what Elena knew, what I knew, and bringing it all together. So just kind of beating the pavement and figuring out all the objects that were out there, that was difficult. But getting it into the museum and trying to whittle it down was so difficult. It was
Hmm.
so difficult because, we do focus on New York City, although we definitely look at important West Coast brands like Cross Colors and
Yep.
Carl Kanai. But there are a million different stories you could tell about hip hop fashion. We don't touch at all about, the influence of a city like Atlanta. There can be 500 exhibitions on hip hop fashion specifically. So narrowing it down was a huge, huge challenge. And it's still one of the largest shows we've done at FIT.
Yeah, I loved it. It just took me back. I looked at pieces that I couldn't afford back then, that were unattainable, and yeah, it blew my mind. I just realized I'm not trying to be a jerk. So I know the Tommy Boy Carhartt jacket is there, and that was like the must-have item. And I
Yeah.
know Monica Lynch literally said that, so she's a little biased. But if I recall correctly, and if I'm totally wrong, then blast me. I don't recall the Def Jam jacket being in the exhibit, because I'm here to tell you, as a native New Yorker, sorry, Miss Lynch, that was the jacket that you wanted to have.
So that was something that was on our board that we didn't end up being able to put in their exhibition. There are many, many reasons why certain things couldn't come, but we do have a piece from Def Jam University talking about how Def Jam went into the fashion business, creating kind of their own fashion line. But again, there's just we could have 100 other
Right.
exhibitions to explore all these really influential items. So we did, because we were able to partner with Monica Lynch. She wrote a little thing for the book and lent us these lanyards from her personal collection. It
Yeah,
was
that
really
was
fun
cool.
to have that collection there, but there were so many things that we could have put there to kind of think about the record companies and these influential pieces.
Understood. Do you want to talk a little bit about the coffee table book that you and Miss Romero co-edited?
So this book was part of our 4-year process, and we draw so much on. It's really an anthology. Neither the exhibition nor the book is a chronological kind of history of the 50 years of hip hop. There's really too much. It would have to be 3 times the size to be able to do that. But we really drew on a number of different authors, journalists like Kim Osario and Emil Wilbekin, who were at The Source and Vibe,
Yep.
Elizabeth Wellington, who was at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So not only are these journalists covering kind of hip hop culture, they grew up in it and they were very much a part of it. And then we also turned to people like Sal Abatello, Ralph McDaniels, Dapper Dan, Monica Lynch, to kind of have all of these different perspectives. So it really was kind of almost a grab bag of the people that we knew we needed to hear from, people who at the time we could get in touch with. But everyone has these really unique stories that go through the history of hip hop. They were there when it happened. They helped shape the culture, and so I think that's really what makes the book so unique.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to cop one. I'm gonna ask for my F.I.T discount at Rizzoli. So, Miss Way, why is fashion important?
Fashion is important because everybody engages with it. Whether you think you dress in a fashionable way or not, you're engaging with fashion because what you put on expresses something about yourself. Even if you're actively trying not to express something, that's an expression.
Right.
It does so much to tell people who you are, what you believe in, not to mention the aesthetic art of fashion, not to mention the huge impact it has as a business in the world, has as a force on our environment. There's a million different ways to look at fashion and think about how it impacts everyone from the largest level to the smallest level. For me, fashion is all about culture. Fashion is a reflection of your community. It's a reflection of, and whether that community is, a community of one, if it's your family, if it's your neighborhood, your city, your country, it's a reflection of that. And there's so much about body politics when we think about people of color or women and how our bodies have been policed, how we use fashion, how, there have been forces trying to tell us how to dress and how we've pushed back against that. And there's so many aspects in fashion that express rebellion, express kind of pushing against these oppressive forces. We can say those things through our clothes. So, I mean, I could go on forever about why fashion is important.
What difference has fashion made in your life?
Well, I'm a fashion historian, so it gave me my career. I went to college to study fashion design. I wanted to be a designer. 4 years of college let me know that I was not going to be a fashion designer, which was fine. And I studied pattern making. I was doing a little theater costuming before I went to grad school to study fashion history. And it was really I took an internship. I was at NYU, and I took an internship at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I took this internship for 2 reasons. It was close to my parents' house, and it paid.
Good
But these
reasons.
but my research focused on the Black Fashion Museum collection, which was a collection that was started in Harlem in 1979 as a museum. And it was transferred and acquired by the Smithsonian. And I did some of the initial research on it on Black dressmakers. So people like Elizabeth Keckley, who sewed for Mary Todd Lincoln, and Anne Lowe, who made Jacqueline
Yeah.
Kennedy's wedding dress. Black women who have shaped American culture in terms of fashion, who've made dresses that have been copied by people that have, helped shape the course of American fashion culture that no one knew anything about. I had never learned about them in my classes. And so it was really from my master's that I became interested in Black fashion makers and the impact they've had on American culture and how fashion as a vehicle for Black people and my studies, Black women, has been so empowering. These were ways for women Elizabeth Keckley literally used dressmaking to buy freedom for herself and her son. But they have been able to start businesses. They've been able to train and employ other Black women. They've been able to kind of create a visibility for Black people that was hard to attain. We see Black people making themselves visible in the arena of sports and politics, and fashion is another space where it's really important to have representation. And that's still an issue that the fashion industry has today. So again, infinitely kind of interesting to me.
And if I recall correctly, the fashion museum that started in Harlem, that was started by Miss Alexander. Am I
Yes.
correct?
Lois
Yeah.
K. Alexander
Yeah,
Lane. Yep.
Lois Alexander. Yeah. I met her, dated myself.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. And she started the Harlem Institute of Fashion. She
Yeah.
was really interested in educating people and creating pipelines for designers of color.
Yeah. When I went to NYU, Stern School of Business, she Yeah, I met her because I used to co-produce a fashion show at the U, as I
That's
affectionately call
amazing.
it. Yeah,
My
yeah,
book, I edited a book called Black Designers in American Fashion, and I start and end with her work and, the work to preserve the design legacy of Black America.
yeah. And that book of yours is about to come out,
No,
correct? Oh, because you have an Anlo. I'm not trying to play myself. So,
I have a book called Black Designers in American Fashion,
right.
which came out in 2021,
Okay.
but I'm currently curating an exhibition at the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington, Delaware, on the designer Anne Lowe.
Right.
So that will open September 2023, and its accompanying book will also come out then.
Right. Also by Rizzoli. So clearly you have Rizzoli on lock.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm gonna be asking for comps. That's all I'm saying. So think I'm jiving. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sending an email. She's gonna be like, I can't believe he did that. No, I meant it. So they have publisher copies. I know this. What's the top fashion tip you would give the everyday man so he could look his best?
I think you have to be comfortable in what you're wearing and like what you're wearing. That translates into your attitude all day. Everyone's had that day where you throw something on, you're like, "Oh, this isn't quite right," but you don't have time and you get out the door and you regret it all day. So be comfortable in what
Yep.
you're wearing. And we talk about this as a concept in the 19th century. Comfort is a mental state more than a physical state. Because one of the things, in women's fashion, people are like, "Oh, wow, how could people wear corsets?" People wore corsets because you were correctly dressed when you wore a corset, and being correctly dressed makes you comfortable. So whatever that means to you and your body, being comfortable with what you're wearing, it's really a mental state. It gives you confidence, and when it's off, you feel it.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's my lane when I'm talking to potential clients. So I ask this of all my guests. So what does always be fly mean to you?
I think it's presenting yourself best. And that means projecting your personality, the aesthetics that you want to present. So whether, it's fashion does so much to communicate about what you believe in, where you see yourself in society and your community. So being fresh, being fly is about just projecting your truest self. And it doesn't have to be eye-catching and ostentatious. It can be really subtle. There's so much beauty and subtlety, especially in menswear. So I think it's just really thinking deeply about what your clothes say about you.
Agreed. I think your lenses are fly. We already know this is fly.
Absolutely.
I'm terrible. That was shameless. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we made this happen. I
Absolutely.
am so dogged. I got in the symposium. It was sold out. I
Well, it's
got you on the
important to be
pod.
tenacious as a journalist.
Yeah, well, I'm just a native New Yorker. Gotta, we dig. I'm like, I'm gonna make this happen, and can't wait for those freebies. I'll be sending you an email.
Send me an email.
Thank you for everything. You see, I totally bumbled it. I was trying to be really smooth, but I just never thought hip hop would take it this far. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for being a part of the culture and also for supporting the exhibition.
Absolutely. It's the only way I could get into FIT.